Excellent. Here we are now streaming live on Facebook. We're gonna spend a little time smiling, grinning at the screen as y'all join the Facebook live stream. Takes a few minutes to get y'all in here. And now I can see the stream. And how do I see the chat? There we go. And I can't see the chat. So I don't know how to do it yet. I'm gonna get started. However, the method of viewing this is not working. Sorry, just a moment, folks. I appreciate your patience as we get started. Live. All right. Okay, great. I'm getting the thumbs up that we are live on screen and ready to go. And so we will get started. Welcome, panelists and viewers. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to thank, first of all, Jeremy Darrow, who helped organize this, the Education Committee, Casey and Ethan, who have been facilitating the tech shenanigans behind the scenes, and IBMA for putting together these panels. Today is part 2 of a 2-part discussion called Love Listens. In part 1, panelists describe their experiences as people of color working and moving about in what is almost always entirely a white culture. I encourage viewers here today to also view that session if you are unable to make it. IBMA will provide 2 links to that in the chat thread. So click on those and save them for later, or there may be 1 link. In part 2 today, we've been invited to discuss concrete actions we've taken to make our events and organizations more welcoming and accessible to all. So I'm excited to kick this off. It's my honor to moderate this discussion. Please welcome Marisa Kolka from Folk Alliance International. She's our communications manager. Lisa Schwartz, she's the Festival and Programming Director of Philadelphia Folk Festival and Board President of Folk Alliance International. Jamie Katz-Court, she's PineCone's Communications and Programs Manager. And my name is Michelle Conceison. I'm an MTSU professor, manager of Delamay, and IBMA Board Secretary and Chair of IBMA's Task Force on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So I like to start off panels by asking a question and inviting the panelists to further introduce themselves so we can get right into the topic, but you also learn a little bit more about each panelist beyond what organization they work at. So, so my question 1 for introduction is, my question to each of you as you introduce yourselves is, how would you describe our community's challenge and opportunities with respect to diversity? How have you been viewing this over time, and especially in recent months? So who would like to be the first? Lisa, please.
I'll jump right in there. Thank you, Michelle, and it's so nice to see these beautiful faces here. Love seeing Jamie and Marisa as well. As you said, I am Lisa Schwartz. I am the Festival and Programming Director for the Philadelphia Folk Festival. And I am honored to also be the president for the board for Folk Alliance International, a role that I know you're very aware of, Michelle. I'm both honored and humbled to be participating in this panel. And I first want to thank part 1 participants, Sar and Jake and Trey and Dan, for their very candid and insightful conversation. I'd also like to acknowledge my privilege. It allows me to have a very different relationship with societal norms and with racial and gender and class and accessibility contracts. And the fact that we're having this discussion and that it has been deemed to be so important by so many members of our community to have this type of open dialogue. It feels reassuring, and maybe like the collective unconscious has finally woken up. It does seem like there's been more urgency in recent months, but I have seen a definitive shift in my colleagues, with my friends, to be more open and to be more willing to have difficult conversations. And that's been going on for at least 5 years. I appreciate, on a personal level, the opportunity to push back on the oft accepted assumption that folk spaces are white spaces. And I think our challenges are ignorance and our overwhelming need, again, speaking personally, to say and to do the exact right thing all the time, and the extreme discomfort when we don't, and the embarrassment and perhaps the guilt. And along with that, having to admit biases that we've put our hands over our hearts and sworn they don't exist. So, pushing back on the concept that good people can't possibly be racist or sexist. So that's my very long preamble to answer your question.
That's a great entryway into this dialogue for sure, Lisa. You're just hitting on a lot of things there. Marisa, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Marisa. My pronouns are she, her. I am the communications manager for Folk Alliance International. We are based in Kansas City on the traditional land of the Kansa and Osage Nations. And just a quick note on that for those who are unfamiliar with the practice. As a national arts organization, Folk Alliance always makes Indigenous land acknowledgements in all of our introductions, and also in our email and our newsletter signatures at the start of all of our public gatherings, whether that be in person or online. And they're tailored to wherever we're meeting, or whether we're meeting in our city or in a different city. And the purpose of making this land acknowledgement is to show respect for Indigenous peoples, to recognize their unique culture and enduring relationship to the land, and just to raise awareness about histories that are often suppressed or forgotten. Yeah, so to answer that question, I kind of want to jump off of what Lisa just said. I feel like we are in a really great space right now. Everyone's eyes are opening a little bit right now for the past few months. I don't know. It kind of feels that way, at least for me. There's just been a big shift in our society in general. Speaking to the folk community as a whole, I think we have an opportunity because the folk community, at least for me, has always been so welcoming, so kind, and ready to listen and ready to welcome new people to the table. To that vein, though, I do think that some challenges that we have are just educating folks and making sure that they're aware of some of the issues that plague marginalized communities. And so I think that's kind of a challenge that we have, is reaching out to folks who don't really understand what's going on, and meeting them halfway, and making sure that they understand why we're doing this work in the first place.
Excellent. I do want to say I appreciate also that the land acknowledgements that Folk Alliances have been making during this virtual meeting spaces is also acknowledging that not everyone has the privilege of internet access and the devices necessary to meet. And I really appreciate that addition to the land acknowledgement as well. Jamie, your turn.
All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm Jamie Katz. I work with PineCone based in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it's a privilege and an honor to be on the panel with Marisa and Lisa and Michelle, and just echoing all that they've said, thanking the folks who put this together, IBMA and the Education Committee, and Jeremy and Ethan and Casey behind the scenes, and also the folks from the Part 1 panel. I definitely want to echo the sentiment to go and listen to that panel, because I think for those of us who do not move through the world with a different color of skin or a different way of being seen and perceived that we don't control. Certainly hearing those lived experiences firsthand is important to consider as we consider our own work as well. So PineCone is a local agency. We have a staff of 3 people. And I would say that one challenge that I think a lot of our organizations face just logistically is capacity, right? We feel like we already have all of this work to do just to get our programs happening and getting people there or getting them online and present day. And, it's a lot to manage already. So I think how we choose to prioritize and take our time to be intentional about making sure that we are building connections with communities who, do not traditionally come into what we think of as our spaces. How do we make those spaces welcoming? How do we communicate with other people? How we make our spaces welcoming and that they are in fact welcome and wanted and invited and included. And I think that's a big opportunity too, to invite and introduce people to music and to say, you think bluegrass or you think folk, and you may have a very particular picture that comes into your mind, but look at what else is out there and what else falls in that umbrella, and see if you can find yourself or find something that speaks to you within that. And I think that's a huge opportunity for all of our communities as well.
I wonder if we can turn a bit, just I do want to speak to present and future, but for a moment, take a moment of history just in your organizations. To the best of your recollection or what if the work that you're aware of started before you were with the organization, how and when did your organization make the decision to take action to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in your membership, bookings, programmings, audience, what have you? I'm going to turn to Marisa first on this one.
Yeah, so I wasn't around really when we started doing this work. I've only been on the staff for about 4 years, but I do know the history kind of when we got started on this, and I have seen a lot of growth in this work over the past few years. I would say that we really got started in earnest in the past 5 or 7 years, although I do think that when Folk Alliance was created, when it was birthed in 1989, I think that it was formed with the idea of intentionally welcoming everyone. I think it's always been at the core of who we are. But again, I think that we really started the work in earnest over the past 5 or 7 years or so. And that started with, again, like really small things like that may seem small, but the land acknowledgements at our public events, that started about 5 years ago. And that's something that's really important that we've been working on doing since then. And then also a lot of behind the scenes things like data tracking, which I think is super important, because when you're starting any kind of work, you need to evaluate where you're at. If you don't evaluate where you're at, you don't know what you need to improve upon, what you've been doing well, where the areas of weaknesses are. So we really started adding demographic tracking into our registration, into our official showcase applications. We started taking those things into consideration when looking at our awards processes and things like that. I think that's really important, because when you're trying to set goals and when you're trying to figure out if you've made any improvements at all, you need to be able to look at a piece of paper and see, okay, what did we do then? What are we doing now? Have we gotten better at all? So those were just a couple things that kind of started out, but yeah, it's certainly been, there's been a lot of work over the past 5 years or so. And there's a lot behind the scenes that we're just making sure that we're setting those goals, we're tracking them, and making sure that it's consistent each year, every year. We're staying on track.
Lisa, how and when? Philadelphia.
So as far as the Philadelphia Folksong Society is concerned, that's the nonprofit presenting organization for the Philadelphia Folk Festival. And when I was president of that organization in 2007, the board made a a very strong and at the time not well understood decision to hire a new ED, a candidate who was considerably younger and far less experienced than what they originally thought they wanted. And that was absolutely to try very hard to gain some insight into a demographic that we clearly had no idea about. At that time, 2005, 6, 7, sorry, folk was a 4-letter word. We could not tap into a generation to embrace as part of the mission, securing the future of folk music and related forms of expression, right? So we needed that information. And much as what Marisa talked about, we knew that there were big gaps, but it really wasn't until 2015 with the hiring of our current ED, Justin Nordell, that the DEI work began in earnest. So very similar in that it was really like 7 years ago, but really tremendous work done in the last 5 years. Same with doing gap analysis, data tracking, demographic work, surveys, lots and lots of surveys with reference to memberships. And then he spearheaded, Justin has a lot of experience with doing stand-up work, DEI stand-up work, and basically going in to communities and trying to help with lexicon, like let me explain to you why that is not a great word to use, but to do it, and to do it with great charm and finesse and a lot of humor. So that's actually when the work for the society came in. I can't speak firsthand because I didn't spearhead that. He did. I can talk about a little bit later. I can talk more about the folk festival, which has been 100% my charge, but seems like there's some parallels in how the work had to get started.
Jamie, the when and how for PineCone, and I know PineCone has relationships with other organizations that somewhat drive disability. So I'm very interested the when and how to make the decision at PineCone.
Yeah, so I've been with PineCone for about almost 12 years now. And when I came into the position, one of the job responsibilities was accessibility coordinator. There is, legalese in being a nonprofit organization. All nonprofit organizations are supposed to have an accessibility coordinator. There was not a lot else in the job description about that, and I didn't know much about it coming in. So it was kind of one of those, like, I knew, kind of where the seats were that people who use wheelchairs could use, and where the ramps were, and where the accessible restrooms were, and really kind of the basic things. And it was really kind of presented as, if people ask for something, we try to figure it out as best we can. And okay, that seemed fine. And then there was one show where I was working, I was in the lobby, and I saw someone sitting in a wheelchair talking with someone who was seated up at a podium. And it just looked wrong. It looked really inequitable to see somebody up here and to see someone sitting down here and trying to have that conversation. And it was the ticketing person who was, elevated up. And so I asked the house manager for the next show, could we put the ticketing thing at a table so that it's, at level and everybody is at the same position. And so that was kind of my first personal really interaction with, there are changes that we can make kind of a little bit more proactively to address some of these things. And then coincidentally with what Marisa and Lisa were talking about 5 years ago, the Office of Raleigh Arts partnered with one of the local arts councils here in the area to set up a learning community specifically around accessibility, and said, we're going to get this cohort of people together. We're all going to go to this conference called the Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disabilities, which is run by the Kennedy Center.
Yes.
And I would strongly encourage anyone and everyone to attend that conference if you get the chance. It is incredibly eye-opening and incredibly powerful. So as part of that, I will admit I went in and got super overwhelmed at first because there were a lot of different things, a lot of moving pieces, and certainly a lot of different disabilities. And how do you address or prioritize or figure out how to accommodate everything, all these different needs, and just it was very swirly and very overwhelming. So to that end, I also would like to offer, if anyone is interested in accessibility work and is just at a loss for where to start, feel free to contact me. I didn't give anybody a heads up on this for the contact information part, but I'll see if Casey and Ethan can add my contact information to the list or contact IBMA for that. But there were some small steps that we took, particularly with partnering with IBMA for the Bluegrass Festival in Raleigh. We set up a sighted guides program, and that was in partnership with the blind and low vision community here in Raleigh. We said, we know there are people who are attending the festival already. What can we do to make it easier to navigate? Because if you haven't been to the festival in Raleigh, it takes over the entire downtown main street, and it's multiple stages and it's all up and down. And there was some talk about, oh, there's technology and you can set things up and that can help people navigate. And we went and talked with some of the folks who we knew were attending and some other folks from the community and said, are any of these programs things that you use? And they said, well, actually, not really. And, the North Carolina Reading Service is a local radio station that basically was set up originally to read the newspaper over the radio so that people who were blind and couldn't read the paper and, before internet and all those things, could still get the information that was in the paper. So we talked with some of the folks there and some other folks we knew who were involved with PineCone, and they said, the reading service does this gala and they have sighted guides. They have people who sign up and volunteer and physically lead people through the gala, and it works great. We said, awesome, volunteers. We know how to work with volunteers. We can make that happen. So that was one of the first forays that we took. Another thing we did, because PineCone does not actually own our own space, we work in other people's spaces and theaters and parks and venues. And particularly in the parks, there were no assisted listening devices available. So we were able to allocate some funds out of our budget and worked with the Hearing Loss Association locally. They actually helped us get a couple extra devices so that we're able to bring a portable assisted listening system to the parks where we do shows. So again, just those small steps. And the last one I'll mention before we move on is just communicating. It's great to have all these services, but if you're not letting people know that they're available, then you're setting them up, to the point of tracking and keeping track of what you're doing and how you're doing it and who's using it. If you don't tell people it's there, they're not going to know to come and take advantage of it. So certainly the communications piece is vital. Having it on the website, having it in the newsletter, having it on the social media posts that yes, this event is accessible, because so many times people will try to go to an event only to find out, oh, there are 10 stairs to get to it. The wheelchair doesn't go up the 10 stairs. Oh, I can't hear it and there's no device, so I can't hear it and I can't enjoy it. And it's not just the people with the disability who you then lose from the audience. It's the people who want to spend time with those people, right? It's their friends and their families and their communities who want to be able to participate in events with them. So they're going to go and they're all going to go together to find something that is accessible for the person who needs that accessibility accommodation.
Yeah, Jamie, I want to just follow up a couple things that you've just said to make sure that it's clear for everyone, right? Because I think that some people who have been doing what we call accessibility work, some of our viewers may or may not be familiar with the language of that work, right? So first of all, I do want to echo what you've said, which is the Kennedy Center is a great resource, one of the great resources in terms of helping presenters and community leaders who are trying to make their spaces more accessible. Second thing I would say is thinking about both from the standpoint of accessibility for audience and accessibility for artists. And I think that's a big topic right now. It's like, if we want to lay out what some of the big topics are in this work right now, it is that a lot of resources have been dedicated to accessibility, the accessibility conversation on the audience side. And there's a whole other conversation of, you know, artists and their access to stages, their ability, access to green rooms, and other needs that they have. The Kennedy Center, a lot, they talk about the needs, focusing on the needs of the different constituencies within that audience. But Jamie, before we move on to the next topic, I wonder if you could just in brief explain for folks who may not have had much interaction with accessibility as a concept, kind of what does accessibility encompass? What are we talking about when we talk about accessibility? That's a big one to put on you, but I know you have thought about it a lot, and you know, because I think sometimes the words are important to know if you're searching for resources, what words to search. If you're looking for resources as a presenter, what should they be thinking? What does accessibility encompass?
Sure. In a real short summary, and this is probably a bad paraphrasing of Betty Siegel, but can they get in, can they get around, and can they have a good time? Because if they can't get into the event, they're not there, period. If they can't get around, well, they're in, but then what happens? And if they're not having a good time, are they going to come back, or are they going to go tell other people that was the worst experience I ever had? And then again, that word of mouth thing just kind of takes off. So at the base level, it is, can they get in, can they get around, and are they having a good time? Now, certainly there are a lot of layers to that. Can they get there? What does their transportation look like? What are the different modes of transportation to get to the place, even physically to start with? Then, you know, are there ramps? How far is it from the parking lot or the parking deck to the venue? Is there, you know, some kind of assistance to get from one to the next if it's a longer distance? Because it's not just, you know, people with disabilities that we can see easily, right? It's older people who have mobility issues, and all of a sudden there's a flight of stairs that they weren't expecting. You know, there's so many different layers to it. And I think, you know, keeping track of even, is the ticketing system accessible? Is the information about the event accessible? If they're blind or low vision, is your website accessible with a screen reader? Or the images or the links? And I will say too, actually, the website is one of the first things that we kind of tackled to try to make more accessible. Again, because we knew, as a primarily music focused organization, the deaf community was not necessarily the first community that we were going to try to work to engage, although we have done some stuff with ASL since, but with American Sign Language. Mm-hmm. Really keeping track of, you know, when, I don't want to derail us too much, but
no, you're okay. This is great.
So screen readers and being able to follow a link. If you just say click here, a screen reader can say click here, but somebody won't necessarily know what they are clicking to. Whereas if it says, you know, link to Folk Alliance website, that's, oh, that is where that link is going to take me. And making sure that we had alt text on our photos so that people knew what the photos were on the site. So things like that, and just having an accessibility page that says, this is what we can do and have in place already. And if it's not on this page, but you have a question about it, please contact us and we'll work with you to see what we can figure out. And since you mentioned Kennedy Center too, I will mention, because just before we signed on to this, I actually saw Folk Alliance has an accessibility webinar coming up next week, and Betty Siegel is one of the panelists for that. So go look that up. I think it's September 9th, Marisa. Does that sound right?
That's a great question. I literally just sent an email about it, but it is next week.
I'm going to say Marisa, and y'all can find that one at folk.org. But I think, Jamie, maybe one other thing to mention, since we're in an environment where a lot of events are happening virtually, and I probably will confess that we may not be living up to our advice right now, is that closed captioning has become much more possible at you know, it's not perfect, but there are more ways to do closed captioning and that are not going to break the nonprofit bank these days. So when doing virtual events, considering, you know, how can you make closed captioning available? Can you make, one thing that was raised to me also was that recently by an amazing artist named Galen Lee, was that that folks are used to requesting certain things, so that it's not wrong to ask if someone needs ASL in a virtual event, and then provide that for the sessions where people have requested it. It's not ideal, of course you want to provide these things for everything, but if you can make it seamless and make it easy to request, that is acceptable. And I'm not speaking on behalf of, it's hard to speak on behalf of people who you are not, but it was said to me recently as a suggestion. And I think if that makes people do more closed captioning and more ASL offering, then that's great. Participation in music, not just for the blind, but for low vision members of our community. So I'm glad we've unpacked accessibility a bit more, because I really want people to understand what we're talking about when we talk about it. But let's get back to, you know, I've just asked you all about when the choice was made and how it started in your organization. I'd like to get into the organizational approach. So Lisa, I'm going to start with you, but everyone can chime in. How did your organization determine what action you would take and dedicate resources to it? And resources could be people, could be money, right? Time. Who was put in charge of the effort in your organization? What worked? What didn't work? What is working? What could do better? How is this part of your work? How is this part of your work guided by your mission, stated values, and strategic plans? And in case anyone watching realizes that I've just asked 7 questions, the approach here is this topic is so huge that I am throwing these questions at these speakers, and they have the right to choose whichever one they want to answer. So, so organizational approach, Lisa first, and then whoever jumps in next.
So I'll speak with reference just specifically to the folk festival.
Please do.
I'm fully accountable for the entire event, every facet of it. There's a million moving parts, and I have to touch all of them. And so I wasn't put in charge of the effort because I actually brought a very specific issue to the attention of the board of directors. And I'll tell you exactly what that was. I managed all the marketing and the press. And so I was also managing through another person, the talent buyers at the time. So I would attend all the programming meetings, and for years, I would suggest artists. I would suggest women, indigenous artists. I would suggest people of color. I would suggest different cultures, different countries. And I was consistently ignored and, quite frankly, dismissed. And it wasn't until that this went on for a few years, and I would, in the wrap up afterwards, bring up my disappointment. There would be a pledge to be more attentive. The next year, the same thing would happen. So we were preparing for the 2017 festival, and I suggested a young artist, a female artist, self-identified female artist, a woman of color, and the talent buyer turned around, and this is an exact quote, and looked at me and said, "Lise, when are you going to wrap your head around the fact that folk is white, male, and middle-aged?" Well, yeah, nice face. I didn't exactly make that face. I was more like, what? Like, it's one thing for you to think that really loud, but to have the absolute guts to say that out loud. So I fired them. I was so appalled and embarrassed. And I went to the board and said, I can't work with them anymore. And they said, great, now you take over the programming. So that got added. This is like, you know, the sort of monkey's paw, be careful what you wish for. So that got added to my duties. And in 2018, was my first year. We were asked to take the Key Change Pledge. We celebrated 55%. Oh, you want me to describe what the Key Change Pledge is?
Yes, I do. And just in case.
So the Key Change Pledge is from the PRS Foundation they're based in England. It's something that is for gender parity. You had to pledge that you were going to achieve gender parity. And this is things that conferences have taken, all events, multinational events. But I am still the only festival in all of North America that has gender parity, not just on the stages, all 8 stages, but behind the stages as well. So we were able to celebrate 55% self-identifying female in the first year in 2018. We've had between 54 and 56% every year, again, in front of on the stages and behind the stage. And it's absolutely a passion of mine. It is, I often hear about, the reaction was somewhat mixed in that, we had some men who were quite precious about the whole thing and said things that as the words were leaving their mouth, they sort of went, oops, and they aren't programmed. They aren't programmed when, it was just unacceptable to not be gracious and to not understand it and not share space. We have members of the LGBT community join us on the stages, behind the stages every year. We have dedicated programming with different cultures, different countries. This year we had 169 artists from 8 different countries. And it was just very, very important to me to get out of the silo and for us to get out of our own way. I instituted a volunteer code of conduct, had meetings with all volunteer leadership, my leadership team, as well as having one-on-ones to discuss discomforts, specific issues with relation to behavior and language. And basically, the reality is if there's a zero tolerance policy for hate speech, and I get to decide what hate speech is. And that's just, that's just all there is to it. From a mobility standpoint, we have an 80-acre farm with varying topography. We're super clear that the physical plant is not sympathetic. That being said, we now have a shuttle that helps take people around the site, ramps, increased handicap parking on both sides and in different locations, increased their spotta pots, so increased handicapped spotta pots. So that was really, there's still way more to do, but that was, to your point, Jamie, little bits. And honestly, I think Marisa mentioned it when she talked about from the very beginning of Folk Alliance, from the very beginning of the Folksong Society in 1959 and the Folk Festival in 1962. We had an espoused culture that's everyone is welcome. You come to the Philadelphia Folk Festival and you never meet a stranger. But if our space was perceived as primarily cisgendered white male, we had a problem. And I needed to look at that, and I did. And while I say our intentions are to be a welcoming group, I never get to decide if anybody feels welcome or feels safe. All I can do is go by the feedback, which I pay a lot of attention to, feedback from all attendees. And then I seek coaching if there's an issue.
I think one thing that you hit on too, and at IBMA, I know we're constantly thinking about how do we go beyond being welcoming to inviting? Like, how do we move from the stage of like, we're going to try to make ourselves welcoming in every way we can, but we have to take that extra step forward of seeking and finding and inviting in people, because you can't just say, oh, we're welcoming, come find us if you want to, right? And I think you're speaking to some of the tactics that really do that, as evidenced in terms of the community being able to reach out to others. Who would like to chime in next? Yeah, Marisa, please.
Actually, it's something to say related to that, but
Yeah,
it's kind of like, if you, speaking specifically to like our conference, you know, if we were just to say, anyone can come, everyone is welcome, and then they come, and then the festivals aren't booking them because they're not interested in those kinds of acts, then they're wasting their time coming to our conference, you know, like, sure, we welcome them, we handed them an invite, but we didn't really set up the space for it to be beneficial to them. And so how does that work for them? So you definitely have to think of, like, it's not just opening your arms and a big welcome to everyone. It's really doing the work to make it truly be inviting and truly be beneficial for those people to be there.
Right. Ooh, yeah. Snaps,
right.
That's good. Yeah. I'll put a highlighter all over that.
Okay, so you had 7 questions. So
yeah, pick 1 or 2 or
so I would say that the way that we kind of when we determined what action we were going to take, it kind of started when we hired our new executive director, which was Angus Fennon. So again, this is before my time, but one of his very specific goals was to diversify Folk Alliance. Like, that was a big focus of his work. And again, you two were board members before I was even here, so you might be able to speak on that a little bit better than me, but that was a big priority of his work. And so I know that one of the first things that we did as an organization was internal training and operational changes. So we've done so many different trainings. I know that you two, I've participated in trainings with you two. I know you two have participated in them without me there. We just most recently, last year, we did, it was a pronoun and gender training, which was so great. It was actually taught by one of our interns at the time, Fawn. It was really, really wonderful. But we've done a lot of trainings internally. And I think that is really important to set up your staff. Like the very first thing that you need to do is prepare your staff to do this work. You know, if you have 7 people who are leading your organization and have no idea how to do the work themselves, or have no idea what any of this is about, then it's going to be really hard to further that work as an organization. So I think that was the biggest thing that we kind of started off with. And then also kind of speaking to our mission. This work, it's ingrained in our mission. We are a global organization. Our mission is to serve, strengthen, and engage the global folk community. And so this work is central to that idea that folk music, it's the music of the people. And it's not just your people and your community, it's all of the people. And so that it's driven by our mission. Every single thing that we do is driven by our mission.
I am going to ask, and I'm going to put this to our IBMA facilitators. I'm going to put this in the chat of the recording that we're doing. There's a link on Folk Alliance's website for equity resources and the trainings that they've done in case people are interested. So if someone could post that to the Facebook stream, that would be much appreciated. Because I have found that very useful in my own self-education, you know, past my time on the Folk Alliance board and working with other organizations. It's great that you all are being very transparent about what you're doing, because other people can learn. We can all learn from each other, and the more we can share what we're doing, the more we can learn from what each other is doing, which is why I love this panel and invitation. Jamie, do you have thoughts on from a PineCone perspective?
Sure. So I think, you know, talking a little bit first from, I guess, again, as a smaller presenting organization, we're still, you know, focused on serving our whole community, in part because, like everyone else, it is rooted in our mission. Like Marisa was saying, folk music is world music to begin with. Who are we to say, oh, well, this music is folk and this is world and this is something else? It's all drawing from so many of the same influences and borrowing from here and contributing over there. And so I think PineCone too, from its inception, was never strictly a bluegrass organization. There is a strong history in North Carolina of gospel music, of blues music. There's certainly a burgeoning jazz scene here. There are indigenous musicians. So there's certainly always been, prior to me starting as well, there was certainly work being done to make sure that all of the different types of music that were home in North Carolina, both that, were more organic here and that have since, moved here and kind of planted roots here, get represented in some form or fashion. I think, again, back to what we talked about at the beginning with some of the challenges and the perceptions, and, some of those perceptions are rooted in certain realities where a lot of our concerts, no matter who's on stage, the audience ends up being predominantly white. And so one thing that, again, we've taken from the accessibility work, but expanded into some of the other diversity efforts as well, is, well, where are we marketing? How are we putting the word out to different people in different communities that we're doing all these different concerts? In doing this work, you will hear the phrase representation matters. And that means, having artists on stage who look different, maybe from the people in charge of the organization or who are the majority of the organization. And that's a separate discussion entirely as well. Who are the gatekeepers, and how do we make that more accessible and inviting and inclusive to lots of different people, so that there are more decision makers and more people who know different people and different artists involved in those processes. So certainly, again, harping back to that communications piece, making sure that when we are programming artists from certain communities, we are then going to those communities and saying, hey, here's this program, what is the best way to let people know so that they can come and experience and see themselves on stage and be in community and be in an audience with other people who, have similar lived experience. So that's certainly something that, again, I think we kind of started learning in the accessibility work and have been able to apply as we've started looking at this more intentionally in the last several years.
Mm-hmm.
And just piggybacking off of what Jamie said,
Yes.
I look at everything, all of this work through a marketing lens, just because that's what my role is. But so, I mean, a specific example of what you just said is we produced a Kansas City Folk Festival. And so we had a lot of Latinx artists on our stages, and we wanted to be very intentional about inviting those communities as well. And so that meant translating our press releases. It meant translating our advertisements. We needed to go out into Spanish speaking or Spanish newsletters or newspapers, and making sure to put advertisements in those. So there's like things that seem very small, but have an actually a very large impact, on, you have to go out to those communities. You have to find them. They're not just going to come to you. You have to show them that you want them there and that it's a welcoming space for them.
And that you've done the research and have done the work to find, to do that outreach, I think can mean a lot in certain circumstances. I want to move a little bit to, there's something you said earlier, Marisa, about the initial work that Folk Alliance did in terms of training and self-education. Of course, we're all in our own journey with learning and self-reflecting and understanding in our own lives, but also with the organizations we're working with. There's a concept in higher education called scaffolding. Here comes the professor. But there's, where it's about it's about how people learn. And I'm thinking in particular about a book I read called How Learning Works by Susan Ambrose, if anyone is interested in this concept. But Susan Ambrose says sort of that there's this optimal state of learning. And if you push someone, that scaffolding is the idea that you create support for people to learn so that they reach their optimal state of learning. Because if you charge ahead and people are not ready, they will shut down because they are overwhelmed. If you do not push people enough, they get bored and they check out and then they don't learn either. And so you have to challenge people enough but not too much. Now, apply this to a concept where everyone is in a different place in their life with self-reflection and understanding of racism, of sexism, of homophobia and other challenges, ableism, and the things we face. I wonder, I know you and I have talked a lot about sort of how do you prepare people for this? Could anyone ever be prepared for this work? How do you set the community up for the conversations and the work that needs to be done while also keeping pace and momentum? And what does it mean to have the necessary education to engage in this work? I'm going to start with Marisa, and others can join in.
Yeah, so I love that concept. That was, you pulled it right out of my brain. Apparently Susan Ambrose did, but she got it for me. No, I think it is super, super important to meet people where they are at. And so this is related to feedback that we've gotten specifically from our community, is that they're looking around at the programming at the conference and they felt like we hadn't really done the foundational work for our community, and kind of just threw them into all of the different programming, the various work that we're doing without setting them up for it. And therefore they're either overwhelmed or they're not interested. They think it's too much. They don't understand it. And so it's really, really, really important to provide people the opportunity to learn that this foundational knowledge to do this work. And so on a really basic level, we set up a page on our website. It's folk.org/equity. And it's super beta right now, but as of right now, it just has a bunch of links to different resources. And one of them in particular, I really like. I think a lot of people have probably seen this floating around on social media, but it's an anti-racism resources Google Doc. It was not created by us, it's created by some other people, but we put it on our website because I think it is so great. And this goes back to the concept of meeting people where they're at. So this lists articles, it has videos, it has podcasts, it has books to read, it has documentaries, it has TV series. It has so many different types of mediums so that people can go in and learn the way that they prefer to learn. That's so important, because if you try to tell someone that the only way to educate themselves to do this work is to read a really long book, and that person doesn't like to read, maybe they can't focus long enough to read, they just don't like it, they're going to be like, well, crap, I guess I can't do this. If that's the only way I can learn, then it's just not going to happen. But there's no reason that they can't go and listen to podcasts or they can't watch documentaries. If that's how they learn, that's okay. But I think it's really important for us to provide those resources and let them figure out on their own how to learn this work. And then when we provide the foundational knowledge, then they can go back into their own communities and do that work. So it's really important to set that foundational knowledge up. And then when we bring out this larger programming, like when we have a panel on diversity, equity, inclusion at our conference, people aren't coming in like, what's DEI? What's the difference between diversity and inclusion? Why are we doing this? What's the point of this? I don't understand. They're like, oh, okay, like you have talked about this before. I understand a little bit of it. Now I'm interested and I'm ready and I'm here to engage. I think it's so important to meet people where they're at. And I think that is the biggest struggle that we have, not just in our community, but I don't know, America as a whole, is that we're just not meeting people where they're at, and we're expecting them to have this level of knowledge that they don't yet. And so it's just really about the baby steps. It's baby steps. That's what all this is about, honestly.
It brings to mind something that I think, Lisa, you said in your introduction, you referred to ignorance. And actually there was a really big moment, I think it was Sal Paul that was talking about ignorance at Folk Alliance, actually, and sort of de-negativing ignorance. Like I think this year I've tried to embrace that ignorance is just not knowing, and we use ignorance as if it is an accusation. But actually I'm ignorant to very many things until I'm not, and I think that concept, I really appreciated that concept. I'm going to let one of you chime in on this because we have a couple more questions to get to, and we're close on time. We probably will go over a few minutes. I apologize to the audience if you are running to another meeting, but I am going to let us go over a little bit because I think we have a couple more really important questions to get to. Jamie or Lisa, do you have anything to add to the scaffolding or preparing the community topic?
I really love what you said, Marisa, about meeting someone where they are. And I know that my audience, whether it's my audience or my volunteers that, you know, there's well in excess of 2,200 of them, they don't like to be taught anything, but they like to learn. And so there's an awful lot of, why are you so sensitive? My God, you know, that type of reaction, or, you know, I didn't mean that. So I do very big meetings with all the festival, what we call chair people, and there could be 70 to 90 people in the room, and then also smaller groups. And I've had to adopt some of their personas, not tell anyone that that's what I was doing, and have people be like, oh my God. And it's like, what's the matter? Were you offended by that? So why are you so sensitive? So that might not work in a lot of contexts,
Right.
but I grew up in this organization, but also with the festival. I've been working with this festival since 1974. I was a zygote at the time. And
That's
in utero.
not possible.
I was in utero. But honestly, it really required, that's sort of my take on meeting somebody where they are, not just call them out on it, but almost like you got to walk a mile, you know. Did you feel, I felt embarrassed when you did that. Okay.
Yeah.
Imagine how translate that situation. So there's been some great passive learning opportunities that way. I know it's risky, but I also know that it can be done in the context of my group.
This is a good segue to my next question, Lisa. Thank you for that. Because
Oh, you're welcome.
Jamie, you and I have had a conversation about listening. And I love that this panel set, like these two panels were called Love Listens, right? I agree that it's that being a better listener is at the heart of this work. What do you think it means to truly listen and employ what you learn in an organization's DEI work? Because we're listening to individuals, but we're trying to understand communities based on individuals, right? Which is stereotyping in some ways, and we have to be careful of that. But how has your organization endeavored to listen and oriented yourself to listen, and then made what you learned from listening actionable? I'm going to start with Jamie on that.
Yep. So in accessibility work, and especially at the LEAD conference and other places, other organizations that are specifically working in accessibility, there is a phrase that is nothing about us without us. And it's somewhat specific in the disability community, but certainly can translate to other places.
It's another highlighter moment right there. Yes.
You don't want to assume that you know what solution is going to work best for a group or an individual, right? So if somebody comes in and says, you notice that they're having some difficulty walking, do you immediately offer them the elevator, or do you say, there's about 5 steps up to where I'm going to take you, but the steps are right here. The elevator is at the other side of the lobby area. Which do you prefer? And they may say, the steps are right here. I can do 5 steps. And that's fine. It's having the dialogue, having the conversation, rather than making the assumption. And it's customer service at the end of the day, right? If you're talking with someone, you're wanting to find out exactly what it is they need. Or the same if it's on the artist side. Same scenario. We had an artist come in, and you know what? The elevator was all the way around the other side of the thing, or the stage level with the ramp was just right there, and what made more sense for them to use to get to the green room, and which green room were they going to end up in, and just having the conversation. But that also requires knowing your space and being able to anticipate what some of the needs, what some of the barriers are. So, just thinking ahead and really having the conversation and being aware enough to have the conversation rather than just making the assumption, making the choice, and taking the choice away from somebody.
I love that. And Courtney, thank you for posting the quote in the chat thread, because I think that's an important quote and one to remember, because so often we're doers, right? In organizations, we work in organizations because we want to make things happen. We want to help the community. We are problem solvers by nature, many of us. And so it's like you want to jump to fix the problem but you got to hear what the problem is, right? I'm going to keep us moving. Does anyone want to add to that? But I want to get to the arena. So does anyone want to add to that thought of listening into action? Any pitfalls or things to be careful of, or times when listening was hard to do?
Yeah, when you say pitfalls, I think there have been scenarios where we're working on programming and we forget to consult with the community that we're trying to uplift. And that is like, we've made those missteps many times, and you really have to remember to take a step back and just listen. And that means if you don't have members of that community on your team, you need to bring them to the table and you need to talk to them, and you need to show them what you're working on. You need to ask them for advice, and you got to talk to them and you got to listen. And sometimes the feedback that they give, it may be challenging to do. Like, it may be challenging just to implement as far as, the structure of your event or whatever it is. But it's really important to just listen to them and to not take offense when you get feedback that may be perceived as negative, and you just have to listen. It can be really hard sometimes, because you think that you're doing the right thing. You think that you have your heart's in the right place, and maybe it is, but that doesn't mean that you're not doing the exact thing that you should be doing. And so just really listening and making sure that you are talking to the communities that you are trying to uplift, because if you're doing it without them, then who are you doing it for?
Yeah, I think a really big shift that's happened, and that I think is a positive shift, is having the best of intentions isn't enough anymore. I think that's having good intentions doesn't change the experience of someone who is marginalized. And I think that's been a good change, but let's walk the talk. And listening it's hard to ask someone. Also, you can't ask someone to solve our problem, right? So how do you ask for that information while being respectful of someone's time, while being respectful of the fact that many people might be asking them to speak, but I think ultimately having the courage to ask anyway, and to not be offended if they don't want to play that role with your organization, and invite as many voices in as possible. I don't know. This is leading into a question which I call the arena, because I can't help it. I'm like a Brene Brown fan, but I want to get real for a second. And this is close to the final part of this conversation, but what does it, when you're in organizations, what does the work feel like? How are you addressing the areas in which you're not seeing the progress, or you're making these mistakes, hitting a pitfall? This work can feel like it's endless. And, where does mentorship come into play here? How can organizations get involved and help each other? If you could imagine, some ideal scenarios where organizations work together, or something exists that doesn't exist today, that could really help the work. I am putting this out to anyone, actually. I'm not going to direct who talks. Abdicating, mediating, moderating responsibility.
You know what? The work feels really hard, but really needed. And And I feel very humbled to bear witness to all of it right now, and to be able to have the opportunity to lean in and to try to reduce harm. I mean, I want to be fluent. I want to be fluid. I'm still making lots of mistakes. I'm still clumsy. I'm still awkward. And I want to get to a place where I can get called out and hear it, listen, and not go, oh my God, but to just to hear it and accept it with grace, and to sit with it, and then to use it to help me change. And I think that's really important. Look, I believe a fish rots from the head down. So if I'm a leader and I'm not willing to take a good look at myself, and the old professor needs improvement, then how can if I'm not willing to change, how can I ask anybody else that I'm working with to do so? I'm always looking at feedback from all the attendees, from the artists, from the ticket holders, from the volunteers. If there's issues, I want to know about it. And I think the benefit of the training from that Marisa was talking about with Folk Alliance has really been incredible. And I've certainly taken what I've learned back to the folk festival, and also, talk to Justin about it in the Folksong Society. I think mentorship is critical path. I think these types of issues and discussions require trust, and there's a necessary intimacy. And so having a mentor to maybe lead the way and maybe model behavior and language is super helpful. I had just very quick anecdotally, I had an artist call me last week and say, I played your festival 3 years ago. I had a very negative experience. I now know you so well that I know that my negative experience has no connection to your intentions. And that's why I'm telling you about it. So a disconnect, meaning I had no idea that everything that I had set up had not worked its way to the volunteers that he was working with. So I so appreciated the grace with which he delivered his experience. And he laughed and he said, I mean, he saw my face and I sat very quiet, and he said, I know you so well now that I know that you want to know this. And I said, my gosh, I wish I knew it 3 years ago, because I would want to have said to you then what I'm going to say to you now. I humbly apologize, and I want to unpack it to the extent that you want to. And he said, no, I'm done. I just wanted you to know I don't feel badly about it anymore, but I need you to know that I know that that's not what you wanted my experience to be. How can you not appreciate someone making that statement?
I'm gonna there's a comment in the chat thread that I kind of think is interesting, and I'd like to hear what the panelists think of it. It's a simple concept of the notion that that what we're talking about is common decency. I'm reacting in the thought of, yes, it's the golden rule in common decency, but to me, I think it's more than that in terms of when it looks like organizational work, there's like it doesn't happen on its own just by being nice. It happens by this continuous self-evaluation that Lisa's talking about, by being open enough that someone will tell you that they had a bad experience, instead of just saying I'm going to not insert an expletive in our panel, but whatever and I'm never going back there again, right? because we're all involved in organizations where there may have been someone who said, I'm never going back there again. I had a terrible experience. And that would have been not because we ever wanted to create a terrible experience for anyone. But to minimize the terrible experiences and maximize the wonderful experiences, the transcendent and inspiring and world-changing experiences. What is your thought on this notion of, isn't this just common decency, or, you know, how do we explain to folks the sort of the work, the reactions from the panel? I'm putting you on the spot. You don't even know this question's coming.
I feel like, dang.
Go Jamie and then Marisa.
Okay. So 2 quick thoughts. One is, you know, again, to look at through an accessibility lens, there's the ADA, right? There's the letter of the law that says this is the bare minimum requirement of what counts as accessible. Sometimes the bare minimum requirement is not the best case scenario for someone coming in. So again, adding the customer service lens, you want to go above and beyond. You want to be that person, that organization that's seen as, we're going to go above and beyond to give you the best experience possible at our event, whether you are the artist or the performer or the tech or the volunteer or whatever your role is. We want this to be an exceptional experience for you. And so I think common decency is a great place to start in the, don't make anybody feel awkward or unwelcome. But then how do you step it up from there to say, not only are we going to, you know, be polite to you, but we are going to make you feel so warm and welcome and part of this community and part of what this is that we are trying to create, that you actively want to come back and tell other people that this is a place to come to.
Marisa.
Yeah, I think, sure, it should be common decency. All of this work should be, but I think that our standards for common decency are far higher than what they used to be. You know, there are plenty of racists out there who don't think they're racist and are really nice to Black people, and they feel like they're, you know, they have common decency, and it's not enough. It's not enough to just be kind to someone, you know. I think that there's so many more levels behind that, beyond just being good to people. We can all be good to each other, but to really welcome people into our spaces and make them feel comfortable, it takes a certain amount of work and understanding of their backgrounds and who they are and where they come from and what their experiences are like to really, really be decent. Although I think decent, that term on its own is like, there's good and there's decent. And I think we should always achieve higher than that.
I also think Jamie's comment, and it's funny because it's a credo of mine, don't make a decision about me without me. So I was really excited to hear you say that. That doesn't really have anything to do with decency. And when someone says to me, from, you know, that might say, I don't see myself at your event. That's not because I'm not a nice person. It's because I am perhaps not considering the impact of a primarily homogeneous audience to someone coming in from a culture saying, oh, I don't see myself here at all. And I don't, and there's, again, you're talking about intentionality. I very much appreciate that comment about common decency, but I also think that the last 4 years have taught us that there's decent and that different people they feel entitled and that their decency trumps your decency. So let's just leave it at that.
Well, I think I appreciate you responding to in real time, and I wasn't even really a question from the chat, but I saw it coming through, and I And I thought that's a really interesting thought. I think that I do want to say I have, as a moderator, broken the rule of going 15 minutes over. But I think this topic deserves every minute we can give it. And I do just want to thank all of our panelists for the work you're doing in our community and for having this conversation today. I want to thank IBMA for organizing and encouraging this work to happen. If you would like to follow up with IBMA's Task Force on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, you'll find more information on the IBMA website at ibma.org/DEI-task-force, which I think the IBMA crew will put that link up in the chat for you. But that is on the website. If you can't find it, you scroll down to the bottom and find it in the links at the bottom of the website. You can opt in to get updates specifically about IBMA's work in your IBMA email newsletter preferences. And another message for IBMA is registration is open for IBMA's virtual World of Bluegrass event at worldofbluegrass.org, September 28th to October 3rd. IBMA will share more information in the coming weeks, but please register now and show your support early. And I would just say to each of you, if you have upcoming events or dates that you want to share, or just information on how people can get more information about each of your organizations, I think that what is the best source of what's coming up for you all before we close out? Your websites, folk.org.
Yeah, folk.org, and sign up for our email list there. And also, it is September 9th, our accessibility webinar next week at noon Central. You can go to our website to register for that.
Okay. And ours is
So you just had your festival.
I did, folkfest.org. We had a custom bespoke platform built. We did an actual folk festival, global, digital. We had attendees from all 50 states and 85 countries.
Is that viewable still, or was that a live event only?
It was. We actually extended it beyond. You're a manager. I had to get permission.
No, that's cool. That's cool. I just want to know if there's some place folks can go to get more information.
They can go to
future events.
folkfest.org about the Philadelphia Folk Festival, and PFS as a peterfrancissam.org about the Philadelphia Folksong Society, who they have a wonderful digital venue and put shows on all year round. We do everything we can do to keep our artists income for our artists.
And Jamie, we sure especially appreciate you making time for this panel today, because you are in the throes of planning for World of Bluegrass. And can you share information about PineCone? Where should people go to find PineCone's upcoming events?
Sure, pinecone.org. You can sign up for one more email list. We'll try not to bombard you. You can also follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Stop by. We're online all the time now.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you so very much, everyone. And thanks to everyone on Facebook. I know we all look forward, or if you're watching this on YouTube later, I know we all are eager to interact with you about these ideas. We all need to keep talking in order to keep making change and learning all the things we don't know yet. All right. Take care, y'all. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, IBMA. Thanks,
Bye
Jamie
now.
and Marisa. Bye.